Good afternoon. Well, as you can see, I'm a little bit more dressed up this afternoon because it's the gala concert tonight for the laureates. I'm sure that you know the results of the competition already. Philip Linoff came first, Kamil Pakolec from Poland, second, Yasuko Furumi from Japan, third, and there were two honorary mentions, one for Sergei Belyavsky and the other for Sechebol Kim. Well, what I'd like to do in this last session with myself is to just recap over some of the points that I made during all of the sessions, and then I'd like to choose a number of excerpts and pieces and performers that actually struck me that in fact I haven't played for you before, or I may have played one or two of them. First of all, the important thing for me was the idea of literature and music. I think you're probably tired of hearing this, but it's terribly important in early 19th century music because of the influence of poetry. So I suggested you buy a copy of Paderewski's memoirs, which are highly entertaining. And the other thing is, on DVD, you can buy this marvellous film, Moonlight Sonata. Moonlight Sonata is a type of rather cliched love story, but Paderewski plays himself as a concert pianist in it, and it starts off with a plane crash. And it involves the usual sort of thing, a provincial boy in love with an extremely beautiful, noble woman, and some other aristocrat is in love with the noble woman as well, and the boy has to sort of compete against this. But it's highly entertaining. It's a black and white film, and Paderewski plays his minuet in the film in an orphanage. Absolutely delightful. You must buy the DVD. Well, the decision was extremely difficult for all of the jury because of we talked about this, the high standard of the pianists and also their rather even abilities. You might think, well, how can people be even in ability? Well, they certainly can today, technically, but of course they bring their own individual interpretation, which of course affects the jury individually and me individually and you individually and so on. Chopin's particularly important in this way. Everybody has their own Chopin, it seems to me. What I suggest you do is, if you like some of these little excerpts or the ones in the studio, do look at the online streaming complete films of these recitals, and then you can come to your own conclusions. One other aspect I mentioned was programming, and that the judges took into account the imagination involved in putting programs together. And some of these programs were very, very interesting, where pieces were mainly contemporary, for example, or there were connections between polonaises at different periods, or a contemporary work like the one that was set for the competition, Moving Frames by Dobrzansky, how this, in one case, was dovetailed into the Terentiev, I think is the piece, right? One observation I had during the whole course of this particular competition was how expression and virtuosity are not exactly comfortable bedfellows. And I think this is a very interesting point to discuss more at length, not with me, of course, but later, about how virtuosity in itself has become an end in lots of ways. Particularly with some young pianists, and the interpretation and side of it probably comes with maturity, if anything. And this dovetails very neatly with the idea of how many young people perform classical works very well. We're talking now about Haydn and Mozart. We heard the Mozart concertos. But how they also, contemporary works, we heard a number of them, apart from the set piece, of course, but that I felt somehow that their romantic sensibility was often a little bit limited. Why? Well, I think it's all to do with reading, and that if you immersed yourself in the rather high-flown poetry of the period, we're talking now about Goethe's Faust, for example, you get a very deep idea of what the composer had in his imagination when he was putting all of these sounds together. Another important point that a lot of people forget is that the jury, of course, were judging the competition on previous stages as well as the concerto stage. And of course, everybody leaps to their feet when the concerto is performed and, yes, he must win the first prize. But they forget of the consistency that's required from stage one. So I'm going to be playing a few little excerpts from stage one a bit later in this program. Another thing we had a luxury of was, of course, 4 pianos, and we were able to compare the sounds of these instruments. The actions were all different, the sound, and also, if you were careful, you would have noticed that individual pianists played differently on the same instrument. They produce a different sound from it, which is probably not terribly surprising. All right, so I'm just about to play you now 2 excerpts from last night's concerto phase, which were the 2 last contestants. And first of all, we'll hear Setúbal Kim playing the second movement of the Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto, and it's an andantino semplice, which this word semplice means that a great deal of personal expression could possibly come into the interpretation. So let's listen to some of that first. Yes, well, I found her expressiveness very, very affecting in the second movement. And as I've mentioned before, the flute solo at the beginning is really very, very, very pleasant. The next performer, and the final one in the competition at the concerto stage, was Yasuko Furumi. And Furumi played the second Rachmaninoff piano concerto in C minor, and I'm going to play a little bit of the third movement of that. Yes, I would describe Furumi's playing as absolutely immaculate. It's like a type of beautiful Meissen vase in a vitrine. It's absolutely perfect in its presentation. Okay, I'd like to, after the last contestant in last night, the jury went out to make their decisions and their negotiations and so on, and we had a very lovely sort of jazz Paderewski session by a quite famous jazz pianist here in Poland, Krzysztof Herdzin. And he played various pieces of Paderewski with his own jazz improvisations, some of which were extremely refined because he's a very fine pianist. He's not of the Thelonious Monk type of jazz pianist. He obviously had very high classical training and also has a great improvisatory skill. And I thought we might hear a little bit of the famous minuet as he approached this piece. Right. I don't know how you react to this type of music being given the jazz treatment. There's certainly a great fondness for doing this to Chopin. And of course, Jacques Lussier started the whole process with Bach, who lends himself terribly well to jazzification, if you like. Play the online stream and see what you think of yourself. Right, I'd like to go back then to stage one and some of the excerpts from stage one, and actually the first piece of stage one, which was so surprisingly moving. No one had actually heard this piece, hardly anyone I spoke to. It was Respighi had written a nocturne, and it's very affecting, with an extremely difficult section in the left hand, which is to give you this sort of haze of evening over the entire piece. Let's listen to some of this rarely played, if even known, piece of Respighi. I thought this was a very charming piece, and of course nothing like the Pines of Rome and the militarism of the Roman Empire. It was a very seductive piece. When I did my Google search on it, I couldn't find anything at all. So it's relatively unknown, I would say. Well worth exploring. The next competitor who didn't make the finals is a very fine Chinese pianist named Bolai Chao, I think you pronounce his name. The sound he made was arresting in this Scarlatti Sonata. It's Kirkpatrick number 1. It's the sonata in D minor. And I think that the sound that Chinese pianists are able to produce is quite unique from the same type of instrument. It must come from a different acuteness of the ear or the touch or something like that. But just listen to this wonderful piece of Scarlatti played on the piano. Well, I can tell you, I think, having played these sonatas on the harpsichord, no pedal, of course, but so crisp, and the durations of each note absolutely correct and perfect. I adored that particular piece, and I will always remember this performance of it, the only Scarlatti sonata that he played, unfortunately. He played something in a great contrast, which was Liszt's transcendental study called Appassionata. I think it's in F minor, and it was the only one of the Liszt transcendental studies that he didn't actually name. I mean, Ricordanza, Chasse-Neige, and so on. But this one, he was not named. But the performance Bolai gave this was pretty super. there's a pretty passionate performance of that, but unfortunately Bolai Chow didn't go very far in the competition, much to my disappointment. The winner, Philip Linoff, impressed me immediately he played, I must tell you. He sort of exploded onto the stage when he played Prokofiev's 4 Etudes Opus 2. And I'd just like to show you this, demonstrate this from the very beginning, the Prokofiev. Well, as soon as I heard and watched that, I thought to myself, well, this chap's going to go a long way in this competition. The next clip is by this lovely South Korean Setubal Kim, and I chose another more or less modern work by Shostakovich, his Prelude and Fugue, and I'm going to play the fugue part of the D-flat major Prelude and Fugue. So that was Kim playing some Shostakovich, and she certainly deserved the prize that she achieved in this competition. Another lady who disappeared was the Russian pianist Polina Kulikova, who I was very sad disappeared, really, because I liked very much a number of the things she played. The first thing I'd like to play from her recital was she decided to play the Handel Chaconne on the piano. And of course, there's been a certain amount of interest now in playing Baroque music on the piano. I mean, Grigory Sokolov, for example, makes a great theatrical effect of playing Rameau in a spectacular way, I must say, on the piano. So let's listen to Polina Kulikova from Russia playing Handel Chaconne. See, I think this works very well. Mainly, I think, because Handel, rather like Bach, didn't use the harpsichord as his sole source of sound. I mean, Bach and Handel were not obsessed with the sound of the harpsichord in the way that, let's say, Francois Couperin was, and Chopin was in terms of the piano. And I think this is a great similarity between Couperin and Chopin. And in fact, the great scholar Jean-Jacques Eigeldinger has written a paper comparing Chopin and Francois Couperin, which is extremely interesting if you ever get a chance to read it. Another lady that disappeared from the scene, much to my disappointment, was Daria Kiseleva, also from Russia, and I'd just like you to hear her playing Scarbo from Gaspard de la Nuit. I explained that Scarbo is some type of gnomic monster who tears the curtains with his fingernails and causes other sorts of havoc in the bedroom. Let's listen to Daria dealing with him. Yes, now, I mean, you can imagine she's very expressive and her articulation is fabulous to create the image in your mind of this ghastly creature, Scarbo. Her variations on La Folia by Rachmaninoff were also absolutely extraordinary, and I must say I was very sad to see her disappear from the competition scene. Dinner is served. Sergei Paderewski played two polonaises which I thought were quite interesting, and I'd like to just contrast Paderewski and Chopin. The Paderewski Polonaise I'll just play the beginning of, and then also the beginning of the F-sharp minor Polonaise, which I think I showed a clip of this once before, but I thought it was one of the most remarkable interpretations of this particular Polonaise I had heard. So let's listen first to our friend Paderewski, and then after that Chopin. And then we listen to the beginning of the F-sharp minor Polonaise by Chopin, which is so dramatic, so full of defiance, so full of joie. Yeah, it's a great pity we can't hear the whole of that, but I suggest you listen to it on the recording of the online streaming of it. I'd like to go back to Polina Kulikova because of this delightful Haydn that she played, which everybody remarked on. I won't play a great deal of it, just the last movement I think we're going to hear. Yes, we've mixed up Polina and Sergei by the sound of it. It's Polina Kulikova playing part of the Haydn Sonata, the final movement. Very charming performance, very, very conversational in style, the classical style, slightly détaché, a lot of energy, a certain amount of affectation. All of the things in Vienna in the 18th century are present there. And I think this is one of the things that I noticed in these overall in the performances is the sensibility of periods before the First World War is almost gone, today. This type of unhurried gemütlich, this type of charm, which invests so much of that, what you might call salon music perhaps, not Haydn, but certainly Paderewski, it lifts it into an area of civilized social behaviour, if you understand what I mean. Something that we're not so familiar with any longer when so many people are unsure of how to behave. very, very charming Haydn, and you should listen to the whole sonata, I think. I'd like to play one example of the commissioned piece, Moving Frames, and it's by Philip Linoff now. Right, well, as this is the International Paderewski competition, we should really end with a piece of Paderewski. And I chose one that Camille Pokolets had played, and I think we could listen to that as we close down this studio for the last time. Remember, this competition takes place every 3 years and is the next competition in size and importance in Poland to the International Chopin competition, which of course is next year in October. And I believe all of the tickets are already sold out. I believe they sold out in 24 hours or something like that, or even less. So it's amazing popularity throughout the world, that particular competition. Monophonic, of course, because it only involves Chopin's music. So let's listen to Camille playing this lovely piece of Paderewski to close this session. The theme variations, Opus 16, number 3. That's it. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that I'll be back here in 3 years' time to try and entertain you a little bit and to choose some of the things that at least impressed me and to make some useful commentary on what we were looking at. So until then, bye-bye then.